And I know, I had one more that I wanted to offer. That I sent out an email. I'm hoping to start up a discussion group about this book, Everyday Sabbath, How to Lead Your Dance with Media and Technology in Mindful and Sacred Ways, which kind of engages with some Christian thinkers from sort of across the spectrum of Christianity in helping folks to think through when we are using our technology and when our technology is using us, and how to strike a balance of that. I'll put it if you're looking on Zoom there. That's the title of it. So I'm going to say I'm in a little bit of a quandary. I announced this discussion group as being on Sunday mornings at 9:30, starting on May 7th, and I had somebody tell me, hey, that's a great time, and I've had someone else tell me, that's not so great. How can we try Wednesdays at 7? So I would invite you, if you are interested, to please let me know the time that works for you, Sunday morning or Wednesday evening, and we'll see what we can do to accommodate folks. All right, that is now all of the announcements, and we will turn to the sermon, beginning with a reading by the poet J. Hume, who is a British poet. This comes from a collection called the Backwater Sermons, and it is a British. I'm just going to read you the description, because I love the way that they describe the poet, or the poet describes himself on the back of his book. J. Hume is a transgender poet, performer, educator, and speaker with a love of ancient church buildings that led him to a sudden and life-changing encounter with the God he had never believed in. So interesting. So in the introduction, he describes himself as so secular, he never even really knew the date of Christmas. But a love for going into church buildings brought for him an encounter with mystery, which opened up something new. So this is our first reading, a poem by J. Hume called What I Couldn't See. The hardest part is realizing you were there for it all. Even in that death dive, drawing into myself, the fevered spiral, the ill health, the nothing else. You were there when the night fell, saw the beating of the flesh, the empty stomach, the microcosm of madness, the bloody tile. You were there for the hate crimes and the filthy pavements, the broken lips, the shouting out for something, anything, this icy trembling, empty aching, the bits of myself that are tucked, shaking away. You lived through the memories I groomed over, that I buried deep, slipped beneath smiles and haircuts and well-fitting but overworn outfits. There's no fooling you. You witnessed the things I don't even say in confession, done when I was yet to see your care. You stood beside me, grieving as I called out, begging for a God already there. It's finding a presence that had been unseen before. The assigned Bible story for the day, the Bible reading, comes from the end of Luke's Gospel. This, as the way the schedule of readings happens out, this is now the third Sunday of the Easter season, but the reading is still situated on the first Easter. So we draw out this moment in the schedule of readings. From Luke chapter 24, almost the very end of Luke's Gospel. It says, it happened that very day, again, Easter Sunday, two of the followers of Jesus, were going to a village called Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem, talking together as they went about all that had just taken place. While they were talking about these things and discussing them, Jesus himself came up and went on the way with them, but their eyes were blinded so that they could not recognize him. What is this that you're saying to each other as you walk along? Jesus asked. They stopped with sad looks on their faces. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, said to Jesus, "You must be the only person in Jerusalem not to have heard of the things that have happened here in the last few days." "Well, what things do you mean?" asked Jesus. "Why, about Jesus of Nazareth," they answered, who in the eyes of God and the people was a prophet, whose power was felt in both his words and his actions. How our chief priests and leaders gave him to be sentenced to death and crucified by the Romans. But we were hoping that he was the one to set Israel free. Besides all that, it's now 3 days since these things occurred. And some of the women in our group greatly astonished us. They went to the tomb at daybreak and didn't find Jesus' body there. And they came back and told us they'd seen a vision of angels who told them that he was alive. So some of the men in our group went to the tomb and they found it, just like the women had said, but they didn't see him at all. Then he said to them, "You slow and hard-hearted people, you're so slow to accept all that the prophets have said. Wasn't the Messiah bound to undergo this suffering before entering into glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted for them the things about himself that were written in the scriptures. When they got near the village to which they were going, Jesus appeared to be going on further, but they pressed him not to do so. 'Stay with us,' they said. 'It's getting toward evening, and the sun's already setting.' So Jesus went inside to stay with them. After he had reclined with them around the table at the meal, he took bread and said the blessing, and he broke it and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And then he disappeared from their sight." Isn't it just like Jesus, always disappearing, right when you start to notice that he's there? They said to each other, "Oh, how our hearts burned inside us while he was talking to us on the road and explaining the scriptures to us." Then they immediately got up and went back to Jerusalem, where they found the 11 and their companions all together. The 11 said, "The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." And so then they related what had happened to them during their walk and how they recognized Jesus at the breaking of the bread. That's the Bible reading. One of my dad's favorite jokes, I have to be careful, my dad is here on the screen. He's now a little bit nervous about what I'm going to say. I can't tell you if it's one of his favorites, but it's a joke that he learned sometime after he and my mom moved down to the mountains of North Carolina. The mountains of western North Carolina, and became real Southerners. I wanted to get 3 of those ordinal directions in there to talk about them being still on the East Coast. Now I've got all 4 worked in. So it's a nerd joke, I know. Thank you. Anyway, anyhow, a joke that my dad learned sometime after moving down into the Bible Belt. I don't know if it's his favorite, but he took great pleasure in repeating it. Went something like this: "How, in the Bible Belt, can you tell the difference between a Methodist and a Baptist?" Is it? You said that's easy. Melinda, no. It's the Methodist will say hi to you in the liquor store. That's right. I wonder if you have ever had the experience of not recognizing someone who you actually knew. I mean, aside from the times one of you might have been trying to hide that you knew each other. It happens to me every now and again when I'm out in the wild and I encounter a church person out of my natural habitat. It takes people a beat sometimes to recognize me outside of my natural habitat because I'm not all done up in my clergy drag, and it's outside of this space. It's the wrong context. So it takes the brain a moment to land on the connection. And then I see the little beads of perspiration start to take form on their forehead when they think of, did they just say anything embarrassing? And then usually the first thing they do is apologize for not being in church, which means that I am a walking guilt trigger. But I guess, you can't fight the burden that the Lord lays upon you. Everybody carries their own cross, right? There's a history professor at Rutgers Camden, my campus, who also lives in Mount Airy. We learned about our proximity only recently. The history department and the philosophy and religion department share a row house. Their offices are in the same row house. So we pass each other in the little hallway of that row house pretty regularly and say hello, often because I'm leaving to teach class just as she's getting back from teaching her own class. And we share the space, so we say hello. And we also see each other with some regularity at the High Point Cafe on Carpenter Lane, which is my favorite one. And we say hello there as well. And I can't tell you how many times we've looked at each other in confusion in the cafe, trying to figure out why we know each other before it clicked. Oh, right, I see you twice a week in Camden as well as here. The brain just takes a minute. The weirdest time for me of not recognizing someone I knew happened when I was in college at a track meet. We took the team bus to Gettysburg College, which is about a half hour from where I was in school. I got off the bus, I headed over to the bleachers, I got myself ready, put on my track spikes, and started going over to the jumping pit when I noticed a man ambling my way. And he looked vaguely familiar, and he was looking at me with intention. So I scanned through the faces in my memory until I finally landed on the fact that it was my own father. And I didn't, he worked 45 minutes away in Frederick, Maryland, and he took the afternoon to come up and watch the track meet. He's a good dad, but my college and my home were two separate environments, so my brain did not make that connection as quickly as you'd think. Had to build that neural pathway there. All of which is to say that maybe it's not so strange that Cleopas and his companion would have a long walk and a conversation with Jesus on Easter without recognizing him. Or, okay, maybe it was a little bit strange. That story took me far longer to read than it took for me to recognize my dad at the track meet. But maybe the story points us to an important reality, which is that what we expect to see shapes what we do see. Our expectations shape what we experience. In the immediate context of the story, that makes a certain amount of sense. On Easter morning, all of the Jesus followers were living under the weight of their bruised and their broken hopes. Their teacher had become yet one more victim of a brutal empire, a campaign of terror against potential troublemakers. And yes, this group of women had gone to the tomb before the sun rose and found it holding angels instead of a body. And then some of the menfolk went and they found the same thing. In John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene sees Jesus and thinks that he's a gardener until he calls her by name. And here in Luke, Cleopas and his companion have an entire hike, a long discussion, and part of a meal before they realize that Jesus has been present there with them the whole hike. And sure, the story says that their eyes were blinded or that they were prevented from recognizing Jesus, which some people interpret as meaning that God confused them until the big reveal. But I tend to think of it this way. How could they be expected to recognize him when they hadn't yet learned to see what they were seeing? Side note, I've sat with this story all week long, and I've become deeply convinced that it holds possibilities for queer liberation in the church. I offer this only tentatively, because I experience the world in a body that I know as cisgender and heterosexual. And I try to be cautious about co-opting other people's stories and experiences. But it seems to me that there might not be any body that is quite as queer as a resurrected body. It's not the category that we know and experience. And that Cleopas and his friend misrecognized Jesus because they were seeing him through the lens of their own expectations rather than through the lens of his experience. So he walked with them through the whole story of how he came to be who he was. I'm suggesting that Jesus came out to them. Came out as resurrected, I suppose, but as a queer body. and that they were profoundly changed because they allowed themselves to see his truth as truth. I say that tentatively, again, because I don't want to take other people's stories. So maybe there is a broader story here as well, which doesn't involve me trying to talk on behalf of others. So I wonder if we can feel ourselves into the story by walking alongside Cleopas and his companion, by standing still with them in their dumbfoundedness and disappointment and grief. Maybe you can call up times when you have felt that potent mix of sorrow that has knocked you sideways. Think of, I don't know, November 2016, you know what I mean. Or every new and terrifying report about climate change that comes out, or the hard news about someone you love, or whatever it was that you read in the newspaper or heard on the news about how in 2023 there remains a groundswell of elected leaders and people who keep electing them who are dead set on clawing the entire nation back to the 1950s or before. You get what I'm saying. Tap into those feelings, and you're right there inside of this story, understanding just how hard it is to recognize what is holy, the holy that is insistently present inside the horror. But then let your eyes be opened to it, even in the hardest places, like, say, Florida. Is Jermaine with us today? Now I'm about to say hard stuff about Florida. I should say, if Jermaine's on with us, not all Floridians. So let me just get that out there. What I mean, you read any of the news that's coming out of Florida, and all you can feel is the shock at the brazenness with which the state is doing its best to erase people, erase whole sections of history, laws against teaching African American history courses, laws that criminalize the mere mention of sexuality and gender. It started out just in the elementary grades, but now they're moving it to all primary schools. It's hard to feel anything other than that the empire is winning. But take a closer look, is what I invite us to do. Earlier this week, the Inquirer ran a story about students who aren't just sitting passively while their education is being taken from them. So on Friday, hundreds of students across Florida from more than 300 high schools and from 90% of the colleges, hundreds of students decided to walk out of their classes to protest the state's censorship. They met at central locations where they got their voter registrations checked to make sure that they were registered. They pledged to use their votes to defend students' rights, and they took part in a 5-minute lesson on a banned history topic. It's part of a movement called Walk Out to Learn. It's being organized by young activists who are attending colleges around the country, but who are themselves recent high school graduates from Florida who are determined to help students in their home state. They estimate, I said this already, there are students from at least 300 high schools and at least 90% of the colleges. High school students who took part also will have the option to sign up for a virtual class over the summer in African American history that it was put together by some of the same professors that created the advanced placement at African American history course that the state has banned. Any students who complete that will get a certification that they can put on their college applications. Another way of saying all this, maybe in church, is that the state is trying to crucify the truth. It is trying to hide and silence and erase. And that's just one story from the worlds that we live in. But it cannot stop resurrection. That is the power of Easter. The risen Christ is there, his feet walking out of class with all the rest. The Spirit of life is there, defiantly alive despite the death cult in their suits and ties and AR-15 pins. The God of creation puts down new roots and sends up new shoots. Everywhere, people are open to creating communities of mutual care. Which is to say, God is with us, hiding in plain sight. We are not alone. She's on the road with us, just waiting for us to recognize her. That is God's good news. Amen.